our Redeemer. Amen. Truly I tell you, no prophet is accepted in a prophet's hometown. We all know the story, or at least the gist of it. On December 1st, 1955, a 42-year-old seamstress named Rosa Parks boarded a Montgomery City bus and changed the world. A good Methodist, she knew the call of justice when she heard it, and perhaps more importantly, the sin of injustice. You see, in those days in Montgomery on the city bus, only whites were allowed to sit in the first 10 seats on the bus. African Americans could sit anywhere behind that unless, of course, somebody needed that particular seat. At which point they would come forward and the entire row would be expected to vacate that seat and to move back, even if it meant standing, even if they were elderly or infirm or pregnant. It wasn't just, but it was the law. And on that particular day, Rosa Parks had had enough. And when someone came back and wanted her seat, she refused to go. When the bus driver demanded that she get up, she refused to move. When a police officer boarded the bus and asked her to move, saying, "Why don't you get up?" she said, "Why do you push us around?" To which he responded candidly and simply, "I don't know. But the law is the law, and you are under arrest." At which point Rosa Parks picked up her bag, stood up, and proudly walked off that bus and into our history books as the First Lady of the Civil Rights Movement. The woman who was brave enough to stand up by taking a seat. Did we mention she was Methodist? In other words, it is a moment in which we rightly celebrate her achievement. We rightly celebrate that moment which was the catalyst for the Montgomery bus boycott, which became that final crack in the foundation of the Jim Crow South, which became that event which launched a young preacher named the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. from Dexter Avenue Baptist Church and threw him into the national spotlight. In other words, it's a moment that deserves to be celebrated, and she's a woman that deserves our adoration. But sometimes we forget that she was not the first to take a stand by keeping her seat. And the truth is, had it not been for a brave Baptist teenage girl 9 months before, who did the exact same thing, Rosa Parks might have never made her stand. Sometimes it takes a Baptist to show us Methodists the way. Sometimes. And so today, at the beginning of Black History Month, in this year in which we tell those stories of hidden figures once a month, we pause in this moment to remember that brave teenage girl that the world thought was too young, too brazen, too emotional to be the face of the civil rights movement. We tell the story of the young girl who stood up and found herself standing alone. Truly, I tell you, no prophet is accepted in a prophet's hometown. Claudette Colvin was only 4 years old when she learned the difference that her skin color made. She was standing in line at a general store when she heard laughter somewhere behind her. She turned and saw a group of white boys pointing and staring at her. They asked her, she's only 4, to hold up her hands, and so she accommodated, at which point one of the young boys came over and pressed his hands against hers, which earned her a quick smack. And an admonition, don't you know, we're not supposed to touch them. A lesson she carried with her her whole life. Raised by her great aunt and uncle, Claudette and her sister attended church every Sunday, and sometimes more often than that. She was deeply faithful. She took it seriously. She prayed earnestly, and almost immediately she understood the disconnect between who God saw her as and the way the people around her who proclaimed the name of Christ treated her. And she told her minister, I don't want to serve a God who would have a cursed race. Who would? A bright young girl, even though she didn't have access to books, she somehow managed to learn to read prior to entering school at that one-room schoolhouse and was asked to go with the older kids up a couple of grades, though it wasn't until she entered high school at Booker T. Washington High School in Montgomery that she really began to be challenged. Sometimes all it takes is a good teacher. Fortunately, she had one. Miss Geraldine Nesbitt told her class early on that she couldn't teach them like other English teachers would teach them because they were just too far behind. Instead, she introduced them to literature from Poe and Hawthorne, Patrick Henry's speech, Give Me Liberty or Give Me Death, and asked them to think about it from their own perspective to understand what it might mean for them. She exposed them to the Magna Carta and the Constitution and helped them understand what it meant. She talked about what was going on in the world. She gave them a Black history lesson and for the first time in their life freed them to be proud of their heritage. It was sitting in Miss Nesbitt's class, of course, that she learned for the first time of Brown versus Topeka Board of Education and what that might look like in their own community. It was also in that class when she learned about the false accusation, the charge, and the death sentence of one of her classmates for rape of a white woman. And hearing about him being thrown in jail as no more than a thing, she decided to take a stand. She began to speak out, visiting him in prison. Speaking out first at home and then at church and then at school and in her community. She just couldn't get her mind around why the adults around her would speak about segregation behind closed doors but not do anything about it in the world. She was a faithful person. She kept playing over and over those words from Amos, that longing for that moment when justice shall roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. And she took a stand. Only she didn't yet know what we would learn later on, that a prophet is rarely welcome in a prophet's hometown. At 3:30 in the afternoon on March 2nd, 1955, almost 9 months exactly before Rosa Parks got on her bus, Claudette Colvin and her friends got on theirs. The Highland Garden bus boarding at Dexter Avenue. They took a seat near the rear exit, and she, of course, got the window. With each stop, they added more and more people onto the bus until all the seats were filled and some black passengers were standing in the aisle. And sure enough, there came that moment when a white woman around 40 boarded that bus and made her way back to Claudette's row and stopped. Fully expecting, of course, for everyone to get up and move back, and 3 of Claudette's friends did, and at that point, the woman could have sat down. There were now 3 empty seats. She could have sat in any one of them, but that's not how segregation worked. Claudette was supposed to be behind this woman. And so she waited. The bus driver called back, "I need that seat." But Claudette stayed put. He said, "You need to get up out of that seat." But Claudette had just been studying for the month before people who had taken stands, bold stands, and she knew the Constitution, she knew her rights, and so she stayed seated. The bus driver called out, "Why don't you get up? You need to get up." At which point, one of her friends from the back cried out, "She ain't got to do nothing but stay black and die." And so the bus driver angrily pushed on to the central station where, getting on the bus, was a transit officer. Now, when he opened the doors, others, almost comically unaware of the situation, got on board as well, one of whom was a pregnant neighbor of Claudette's who, seeing an open seat next to Claudette, went and sat down. The officer, of course, encouraged her to get up, and she did, but Claudette stayed put. The officer asked her to get up, but she refused. Exasperated, the officer turned to the bus driver and said, "I actually don't have any authority to arrest her," and so the bus driver angrily pushed on to another stop where he had called ahead and had 2 Montgomery police officers waiting. They boarded the bus already furious. "Who is it?" The bus driver pointed back to Claudette and said, "I've had trouble with that thing before." That thing before. The officer got 2 inches away from Claudette's face and began to yell. Claudette began to cry, and she just kept saying, "It's my constitutional right to sit here as much as that lady. I paid my fare. It's my constitutional right." At which point the officer kicked Claudette, knocking all the things off of her lap, and began to drag her out of the bus bodily. She didn't fight back. She just went with them, but she kept saying over and over again, "It's my constitutional right. It's my constitutional right. It's my constitutional right." They threw her in the back of the car. They handcuffed her through the window. And as they drove around town calling her vile names and making lewd comments about her bra size, she began to pray. She said the Lord's Prayer and the 23rd Psalm over and over and over and over and over until it was over. She was 15 years old. And instead of taking her to the juvenile center, they took her and booked her in the county jail. Without so much as a phone call, they slammed the door, and Claudette said that the sound of that lock turning was the worst she ever heard. Truly, I tell you, no prophet is accepted in a prophet's hometown. One of her friends who had been on the bus made it home and immediately called their minister, the Reverend H.H. Johnson. He went and picked up Claudette's aunt, and they rushed down to the jail. They bailed her out, and when he saw Claudette, he said to her, "I'm proud of you. We all pray for freedom. We just keep praying and praying, but you're different. You want your answer the next morning. And I think you just brought the revolution to Montgomery." They waited up all night for the Klan to arrive. News travels fast. And immediately, as happens when people start sharing, people took sides. Some people, like Miss Nesbitt, embraced Claudette and celebrated her bravery in that moment, but others, like most of Claudette's friends, began to push away. When the hearing came, Claudette did something that no one else who had ever been convicted or charged with breaking the segregation laws had ever done. She pleaded not guilty. A young attorney, Fred Gray, took on her case, thinking that it just might be the case that they needed to challenge the segregation laws. But he said to Claudette, "If you plead not guilty, you need to be aware of what might come at you, up to and including lynching." And yet in her heart, she knew she could do nothing else. Her faith commanded her to do something. In the end, she was charged with breaking the segregation law, with disturbing the peace, and third, almost laughably, with resisting arrest and assaulting an officer. A judge found her guilty of all three. When she appealed, the new shrewd judge dropped the first two charges, thereby stopping any chance of challenging the segregation laws and leaving Claudette with a criminal record for assaulting an officer. Almost immediately, she became a pariah. Everybody pushed away. People kept saying, "Why did you bother to stand up, to say something? Don't you know it made it harder for us? Why did you speak out? You're just too emotional, too much. You're too young to make a difference in this world." And she found herself, more often than not, alone. She had Sunday mornings at church still. And on Sunday afternoon, she began to attend the NAACP youth meeting, led by a middle-aged seamstress by the name of Rosa Parks. I think she was Methodist. Mrs. Parks became interested in her story, and each time she would come to the group, she would have her tell it again, just to hear it again, to learn from the story. But Sunday is only one day of the week. And for the rest of the week, Claudette found herself alone and, what's worse, lonely. No job would hire her. No friends would hang with her. And the movement had moved on. Which was perhaps why, when an older married man started paying attention to her, she quickly found herself in over her head. And in the end, even more lonely. Her pregnancy meant she was expelled from Booker T. Washington High School. It meant that the leaders who had once praised her now pushed her away. And so it was on that day, on December 2nd, when she received the flyer letting her know of the Montgomery bus boycott and a Miss Rosa Parks, that she found herself on the outs. And yet she wouldn't stay there. Almost immediately, she began canvassing for the bus boycott. She began going all the way across town to meetings, helping her aunt figure out how to work the ride-sharing program, began going and being there as Dr. King preached, as she heard people speak, trying to speak out herself, even when it meant sneers and jibes about how she must be a troubled teenager, given that she was pregnant. And then the moment came. You see, Fred Gray, that attorney who had represented her at first, knew that the negotiations with the city of Montgomery were not going well. And a few months into the bus boycott, he had this idea: what if they brought a federal charge against the segregation law on the grounds that it was against the 14th Amendment? But he needed, in that case, Browder versus Gale, for plaintiffs to come forward who had been affected by segregation in the buses. None of the men wanted to do it, of course, for fear of workplace retribution, and in the end, 5 women came forward, 1 dropped out, leaving Claudette and 3 others, one of whom was a teenager who in October, inspired by Claudette, Mary Louise Smith, who also refused to give up her seat. They knew that Claudette's testimony would be the most powerful, and so they saved her for the very end. And so it was on May 11th, 1956, just 1 month after she gave birth to her son Raymond, that this brave Baptist teenage girl sat down again for freedom, this time by literally taking a stand. They say that when she began to speak, the room grew quiet. She slowly, carefully told her story, and the weeping began. When she got finished, she survived a grueling cross-examination in which she was questioned about her own character, her own morality, about her own reason for doing this, but she just kept telling the truth, speaking the truth to power, something that some of us struggle to do. And then she was done. The judges decided 2-1 that segregation was illegal. It was upheld later by the Supreme Court, and it became that case. Browder versus Gale became the case that ended legal segregation in the United States. And had it not been for that brave Baptist teenage girl, it might have never happened. Friends, our faith is about more than sitting in church on Sunday mornings. It's good to be here, but it's about standing up when we see an opportunity. It's about speaking out when we have a chance. It's about doing the right thing, not because we'll receive accolades, as we know we probably won't, but because we can't do anything else. Because the gospel of Jesus Christ compels us to do something in this world. Look around Rochester. There are things we can be doing, but only if we're willing to do those hard parts. What is it that you would be willing to stand up for? Let's do it together. It may be true that a prophet is not accepted in a prophet's hometown. But as young Claudette Colvin reminds us, that shouldn't stop us from speaking.